Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farba. The final day of the G7 summit in France has produced a series of commitments, including stronger backing for Ukraine, potentially tougher sanctions on Russia, and renewed calls to reform the global development system. The gathering also focused leaders' attention from Ukraine and Iran to energy security and international trade. Joining us now to wrap up the summit is Ian Goldin, Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Professor, if we look at this final day, we've already had that joint declaration, quite strong and supportive words for Ukraine in particular. What do you think is the main takeaway from all these leaders gathering there in France?
I think the main takeaway is that it hasn't gone off the rails. It seems that President Trump has been relatively well-behaved and cooperative. He has derailed some previous G7, so that's the good news. There's no bad news coming out of it. There's no disarray. Statements which are, as always, well-intended. And the real test, of course, is going to be delivery on them. Strong, positive words on Ukraine, that's very encouraging. But the question is, will this be followed up by further support from, for example, the US for Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I think an achievement, as you said, he's actually stayed there. Donald Trump has stayed at this summit. The last one, he left early. His signature, at least his commitment from the U.S. is there on paper. So as you see the momentum, let's see how that goes. But at the same time, curious about also what he said. I think with also in the last 24 hours prompted on the war in Ukraine, Trump said very much it has no impact on the United States. But he's also said that Russia should make a deal. So a little bit contradictory. I mean, this is classic Trump, or how do we interpret those words?
It is classic Trump. I think there must be things going on behind the scenes. I think they're trying to get Putin to move on a deal and reducing expectations. Meanwhile, he's so many times in the past President Trump has said, we're about to make a deal and it's not happened. And I think there's a little bit of caution now, but it would be encouraging if there were stronger sanctions from the US on Ukraine, and if there's more pressure, stronger sanctions on Russia and more pressure on President Putin to come to a deal. But I don't think we should expect anything to happen soon on that.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think in the background, before we get to Hormuz and Iran, I just still want to have one more on Ukraine, if we may. There's also talk of potentially giving licenses to the Ukrainians to actually maybe even build the interceptors, the Patriot battery interceptors, etc. Ultimately, do you find that that's going to have more of an impact? Is that more critical than, let's say, more weapons shipments, or they need both? Or how do you see that? Because I think that was a critical one that Ukraine wanted.
I think they need both in the medium term. Of course, the capacity to build these short term is not really there, so it would take some time. So they need the immediate assistance as well with the Patriot and other missile defense systems. But in the medium term, I think it would be an important part of the European defense strategy for Ukraine to have that capability.
Mm-hmm. So President Trump has come from the United States very much, not just from his birthday party, but also with this apparent victory, this new agreement between Iran and the United States, settling this conflict. Strait of Hormuz is factored in there. Now, what do you make of this? How much does an opening of the strait, if that does appear to be the case in the next days or weeks, how much does that also impact leaders, especially in Europe, to squeeze on Russia in terms of Ukraine?
I think it's very important. We've basically gone back to where we were before the war in terms of the economic. It's going to take some time for this to calm down in markets. There's going to be a long lag before we really see many of the things that have been blocked getting into markets, fertilizers, chemicals and other materials are getting through those straits. So it's going to be a long lag, and there's a lot of shipping blocked up. But I think it also does mean that Russia's no longer as important as an oil exporter and gas exporter because of the alternative sources. And so the easing of sanctions on Russia that resulted from the war, I think can again be tightened. And for example, the special exemptions for India, the other exemptions that have been granted should now be closed.
Mm-hmm. And with the main headline items as well, I mean, if we look at other declarations, there was also looking at international partnerships as well, stressing at the Evian summit that leaders were looking here, and I'm quoting, at international development and the world's most vulnerable population should be stressed, and reforms still need to be, let's say, undertaken here. So give us your take on what does that mean tangibly and practically.
These are sort of statements that are rolled out at every G7. It's good to see that they're there. The US is on board with it, so that's the good news. But there's a very big gap between the bold statements that are made at G7 meetings and implementation. And I'm afraid that there's very little that's likely to happen in practice. I think the one statement that will lead to action is on containing Ebola in the DRC Congo. So that's important. There's no strong statement on AI. I think there was an intention to be one. So that's a bit worrying. We really do need AI safety to be much higher on the G7 agenda. But G7's already shows of solidarity, shows of cooperation. And I think the big takeaway from this one is that although President Trump has had spats with virtually all the G7 members, certainly with Carney, with Maloney, with Macron, with Merz, with Starmer, it looks like those are being put behind them and there's a show of unity, and that's very important.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned AI, and I think this is also something the Europeans, especially President Macron of France, wanted more of and focus on. So is this ultimately a disappointment for him, or is it just a setback?
I think it is a disappointment. I think it shows the power of the tech companies in the US to frustrate that sort of global agreement. It also is significant that there's no real strong statements on climate change, which is another pressing global emergency. Even the pandemic statements are rather weak. So I think the G7's got as far as it can, with the US being where it is at the moment. I think the statements are better than could have been expected in some respects, but I don't think we should expect the world to change as a result of this G7.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said it's gone as far as it can, the G7. Also, we had some presence as well of the global south. We've had Mr. Modi of India. We've had President Lula from Brazil, and other countries that were also invited as guests. Just quickly, what does that signify to us? And is the future maybe in the G20, which is just some months away?
There's always guests that have been invited to these meetings. Historically, the host country invites friends and guests. They tend to typically come for 1 or 2 sessions. I've even been at G7 meetings where they just fly in across the world for a lunch. So it's a long way to go for a meeting. But it's important symbolically that the G7 understands that it's now not even half of the world economy like it was when it was established in 1973, and that it needs to include others. Of course, the big noticeable absence is China from it. And they are a very significant part of the world economy, almost as big as the US now. So it remains the old advanced nations club. But it is important that others are included. Very little comes of that, and very little comes of the G20 either. These G meetings and G constellations, I think, are really opportunities to try and contain negative things happening, to try and overcome differences, and are part of a process of global cooperation. But they don't have an executive function. There's no way of ensuring that the decisions made at these meetings are implemented, and each country that then hosts the next year has its own agenda. So the real problems of continuity and implementation associated with these G processes.
All right, so an interesting gathering, but as you said, we'll see how long those guarantees or those ideas hold that are discussed there. But look, thanks so much for highlighting all that. Really appreciate it. That was our guest here, Professor Ian Goldin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great pleasure to be with you.
And thank you so much for watching, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.